All right.
Recording's on?
Recording started. Yep.
Okay, thank you and greetings. First of all, I'd like to introduce myself, Claude Lawrenson, member of FNNBOA, First Nation National Building Officers Association. We do a lot of work, certainly in the housing part of, we'll say, a community, and certainly with education and development. But before I go too far, I would like to recognize and acknowledge that I reside in southwestern Ontario. And it really is considered the Three Fires Confederacy traditional territory of the Ojibwe, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi nations. I would also like to acknowledge the many other communities and Indigenous nations that call this beautiful land that we live in home. As such, I'd like to give thanks to the land and the surrounding waters that sustain us. Again, I thank you. A couple of housekeeping notes, please. I'd like you to post questions if you like at the very end. They will be monitored for response at the end of this presentation. I also would like to send out a reminder about the French version, the Francophone version, that will be offered on September the 23rd at 10:30 a.m. And certainly a recording will be offered as a follow-up to this presentation. The other thing, last but not least, complete the questions and feedback surveys that we will be issuing. We welcome your feedback, whether it's now by your feedback simply on a chat or discussion, but certainly the responses to a post-webinar survey, hopefully you will also complete. Again, our topic today is on moisture management in Indigenous housing. I'd like to indicate that really, when we start talking about moisture management, probably a fair amount of you are already aware of the issue, what we like to call the M word, mold. So this presentation is designed to provide a high-level overview on mold. Is it really a hidden danger? Mold is everywhere. Wood frame structures are vulnerable to water and moisture. And water and moisture are constantly moving through the roof, the walls, and the ceilings, mainly by the air currents. Most often as a vapor, condensing and adhering to various hosts. Every house dries out to some degree, but gets wet through the changes in our seasonal cycles. Let's talk a little bit about the objectives of this webinar. The learning objectives includes the following general principles. Exposure to mold has varying effects regardless of whether it is in the building or its impact on the occupants. You will gain a basic understanding of moisture control concepts, and practices for integration into renovations or even for the new builds. Mold is a problem first and foremost because it is an indicator of high moisture content. But it has a huge impact, certainly on our buildings. Therefore, it is important to stay ahead of this curve and realize where the danger lies so the potential for health and safety concerns can be addressed. Oops, going the wrong way here. Next, this webinar provides a fact-based overview of mold in our buildings. Mold needs 4 things to grow: oxygen, a temperature between 40 degrees Fahrenheit to 100 degrees Fahrenheit, or 4.4 to 37 Celsius, and certainly an organic food source, but not at least. What about moisture as the 4th thing that it needs for mold to grow? Not surprisingly, mold is commonly found on lumber and in wet areas. Other examples are soiled carpets in moist areas, damp basements, and closets full of stored goods. Condensation on windows, unsealed joints at the wet areas, just to name a few. So we're going to also take a look at some guiding principles next. So better homes means happier, healthier occupants and communities. This is actually an image of in a community, Walpole Island, close to where I live, southwestern Ontario. First, let's talk about the guiding principles to avoid mold. Moisture-related problems in building enclosures have 3 root causes. 1, external sources of moisture. The second, internal sources of moisture. And the third, construction moisture that's present in many building materials. For example, wet lumber, cast in place concrete, even the drywall mudding process, just to name a few. Mold will grow wherever there's moisture, moderate temperatures, and a food source. All homes built on First Nation territories are subject to the latest version of the building code, the National Building Code more specifically, or at least a local standard that exceeds the requirements of the National Building Code. The rationale for that is even if not all homes are inspected, it remains the responsibility of the First Nation to ensure homes are designed and built in accordance with the current National Building Code. So what we need to do is know where we build, how we build, and certainly have a knowledge and understanding of meeting those acceptable building standards, just to name a few of the points there on this particular slide. Next, the houses that work like a system. So basically speaking, the house is a system. There are three major parts of the house as a system. In the image, we can see there's the building envelope to the left, the mechanical systems, things such as the heating and cooling systems, the ventilation, and certainly the occupants. A fourth element to consider is also that external environment. Houses need to be built based on the climate where they are located to deal with the temperatures of the region year-round, the wind conditions, and exposure. Things such as water table, flooding potential, and the precipitation in the area, such as the rain and snow. In general, the outer skin, the building envelope, is a key line of defense for alleviating water and moisture infiltration into the interior. Moisture problems become mold problems. As we can see in these two particular photographs, we can see new construction mold development by the dark areas on the wood framing to the left-hand side in particular. In an existing residence, those dots on the ceiling and the darkening of the color within the ceiling, signs of moisture. So the problem begins with basically when the framing actually gets wet. Once wet, fungal destruction starts and grows. We can readily see that the moist, wet surfaces can create mold in just about any home. Wet or humid conditions for a sufficient length of time and on an appropriate surface supports mold growth. If you can see it or smell it, there is a problem. Immediately investigating dark, discolored areas, particularly on wall surfaces, ceilings, and any readily accessible concealed areas. As such, it's recommended that the occupants contact their housing department as soon as any evidence of moisture problems are noticed. We know that people make moisture, but let's take a look at also some other things here. Remember the old drafty house? I lived in one. They rarely developed mold because the walls were not air sealed or insulated. The warm, heated air leaked out, drying the assembly before the moisture could cause any damage. Dry building materials won't stay dry and mold-free unless they are properly stored. This image indicates a 3/4 by 3/4 inch hole, or 2 centimeter by 2 centimeter as illustrated, in a building envelope that can generate up to 30 liters of moisture. Therefore, good builders spend time and effort detailing those water-resistant barriers, ensuring adequate insulation and ensuring proper sealing to reduce the moisture problems. We can see that air leakage can account for up to 30 to 50% of a home's heating bill. And a quart of softwood, for example, releases 130 liters of water over a heating season. So let's talk about a few of the key points. Basically, let's talk about the sources of moisture are not managed, mold will grow. Houses that work as a system. A house is part of the local environment. Everything begins with a good site and a foundation. Moisture generated by the house creates mold if it's not managed. We want to build tight, but ventilate right. And excellence in technical building skills is essential, as is building code compliance and certainly reliance on systematic inspections. Houses need to be built with the occupants in mind. Next, let's do a little bit about understanding moisture. Moisture or water vapor moves in and out of a home in three ways: with air currents, by diffusion, through materials, and by heat transmission. These are three examples of inspections that I had completed in the past, and we can see over to the left moisture, water damage to the interior side of this particular basement, certainly on the back side of the wood sheathing. The middle one is basically, this was the attic hatch that had been insulated with a polyethylene vapor barrier, in which it's hard to see in this image, but on a large point of view, you would see all the moisture droplets trapped within the back side of the plastic and basically adhering to that fiberglass insulation. An open crawl space is the third picture, in which you can see the moisture, the dark areas of condensation on the inside of this particular crawl space. So if we remember that 2x2 hole illustration, moisture and water in its ability to move through walls, ceilings, and floors, as we call it, the building envelope of a home, by air infiltration and also by diffusion. Moisture tends to move from an area of higher to lower temperature in moisture content, thus often referred to as infiltration coming in and exfiltration going out. These photos provide obvious signs of moisture movement. The laws of physics governs how moist air reacts with various temperature conditions. The temperature and moisture concentration at which water vapor begins to condense is called dew point. We'll talk a little bit more about dew point shortly. So moisture is unavoidable. However, it also is controllable. So we're going to talk about a few of the points on this particular slide. So moisture can lead to mold. We've already heard about that. So mold is a symptom, but moisture is actually the problem. Fixed to moisture basically means we can fix the mold. Certainly, we realize that home occupants can produce a lot of moisture through daily living and bathing activities, cooking, washing, clothes drying, and so on. Moisture can come from building materials. It enters a home through contact with the ground and through weak points in walls, windows, doors, and roof. And moisture can also come from other sources, such as, for example, the plumbing system. So here we see air flows in and out of the structure due to temperature differences. Above grade moisture can dry to the outside or to the inside, depending on temperatures and the moisture conditions. Below grade moisture can only dry inwards. So when we view the slide, we see even in a house without leaks, there is constant moisture movement. At any given moment, the moisture level in this house is equal to the moisture generated by the home occupants. Additionally, the moisture that migrates into the home from the wet soils or wet air minus the moisture that is ventilated and exfiltrates out of the home. The other factor, the amount of moisture absorbed by a housing material and furnishings are reabsorbed from the materials to the air. It is a reasonably large factor. For instance, in the fall, the house must get rid of moisture. It is absorbed through the summer, and often that takes several weeks. Generally, the higher moisture level inside, the more you can ventilate to lower the humidity. This usually applies in most locations within Canada. It's a very effective way to reduce moisture. Ventilation of a cool basement in the summer can increase the moisture and condensation on the cool basement surfaces. I personally know, because all summer long I've been running my dehumidifier in my house to reduce that moisture. So when does mold become a concern? Well, certainly mold is a concern. Health impacts are broadly related to the presence of mold. Those affected may have an increased risk for respiratory symptoms, such as asthma and certainly respiratory infections. So a saying there from Norm Peters from Akwesasne, sick people come from sick houses. And that's meant in regards to their health. So mold problems are moisture problems. These photos are from a recent new house build close to my area, where mold is already present on the framing materials. Unless caught in this case by an inspection, who would have known that the mold is already present? So when we take a look at the images, I can point to there's dark areas here, dark spots on the wood. This is the cross bridging, and this is the floor framing, so cross bridging, mold already present within the wood. So again, to avoid mold, you might say right from the beginning of a build, keeping an eye on things is very important to see if mold's already taken hold within the house prior to even moving into the house. So again, pay attention to construction details that affect moisture intrusion, and certainly educate occupants about moisture management, and certainly the importance of good ventilation in a house. Moving to our next slide, let's touch on a few more key points. So we can see the only truly way to prevent mold growth in a building is with careful management of humidity, condensation, and water intrusion via the building envelope. You think about things such as leaks, floods, or even plumbing failures. Unquestionably, early detection can prevent it from becoming a bigger problem. As you can see here, mold spores are everywhere, but they can only germinate and grow under damp conditions. If the area is wet for long enough, mold will start to grow within 48 to 72 hours. Mold problem is a moisture problem that was not fixed. When renovating, if you don't fix the moisture problem, the mold will return. So mold leads to certainly health problems, and certainly, as we know, house problems. Again, we come back to that similar image, and we're going to talk about the house as a system. So when we talk about the house as a system, the house as a system is about the relationship of the house systems and how changes to one part of the building affects the other parts. Next, we're going to look at heat, air, and moisture flows in and out of the building. One of the most important measures for effective moisture management is the continuous air and vapor barrier system. We will talk about that in a little more detail shortly. However, moisture comes in three forms: liquid, vapor, and solid. It does most of its damage in the liquid form. We aren't really worried about high vapor content unless it condenses. Moisture moves by one of four mechanisms, but the most important is liquid water flow. The least important is certainly vapor diffusion. So we can see here in this particular image, again, the air barrier, and certainly bulk water movement, rain, snow, or groundwater. And the other ways it can be carried is through capillary action, capillarity it's called, and air transported moisture, and through vapor diffusion. So when we talk about managing moisture, means identifying some of the sources, or at least most of the sources. Identify the sources of moisture, since these conditions need immediate attention. It's easy to spot window condensation, but what about what you can't see? These conditions cannot be left unattended. So when we look at the images over to the right-hand side, we can see how moisture moves. It could be through a roof leak. It could be through water wicking up through the end grain of the wood framing. The difference with vapor diffusion, when we have holes within the building, or gaps within the building envelope, moving from high pressure to low pressure. So vapor diffusion. And also, when we think about our ceilings in areas such as openings in the ceiling, whether it be a fan, a light, or some other type of opening, the flow of air and moisture can move up into the attic space. So when we take a look at some of these sources: damp flooded basements, crawl spaces, wet attics, frost on the roof sheathing in the winter. We've seen some good examples of images of those in some of my inspection reviews. Leaks from roofs, walls, windows, and certainly plumbing. Lack of air movement. Lack of air movement requires ventilation. Get the air moving to reduce moisture buildup. And certainly, last but not least, often we might see the condensation on windows. So we talk about the summary and understanding of moisture. We need to talk about the surface water, the groundwater, lifestyle, and leaks. So water comes from several sources. Surface water that comes from rain, melting snow, poor grading around buildings, all means it leaks into our basement or possibly crawl space. In some cases, it causes flooding, and other instances, it results in leaks. The changing water table in the ground, as an example, is based on seasonal fluctuations. In some instances, a high water table, if not pumped down or drained away, can cause flooding in basements or crawl spaces. Even in instances where it doesn't cause flooding, it often means considerable moisture is still being drawn out of the ground and up and into the home. When it comes to lifestyle, there are many variables: cooking, laundry, bathing, the number of people living in that house, plants, pets, hobbies, cleaning, firewood storage in the house, and ventilation requirements all impact moisture levels. Studies have shown that leaks can be real problems introducing mold and even potentially dangerous molds. All good reasons to stay on top of roof leaks, plumbing leaks, certainly, and leaks below windows, and so on. So how do we control the heat flow? Insulation is often associated as a way of controlling heat flow, but there is more than that to understanding the building dynamics, getting back to how a house actually works. That directly leads to applied and updated construction techniques. It's also important to realize that this depends upon the design of the home and the time of the year. Therefore, controlling heat flow applies to heat moving into the buildings as well as heat moving out of it. Once again, if we are not sensitive to the house as a system approach to a building, the same well-insulated airtight building envelope that provides for both warm indoor environments in the winter and a cooler one in the summer. This also can result in overheating in both summer and winter, and indoor temperatures perhaps that are too high, as well as trapping moisture to varying degrees inside the house. So again, we see here an illustration about heat moves through the walls, windows, and doors and ceilings, and through the floor of a building structure. Heat flows from hot to cold. So when we think about it in the winter, it's going from inside towards the outside through the exterior walls, ceilings, and so on. Heat flow can never be stopped. All you can do is slow it down. And that's basically what insulation does, is reduce the transmission of that loss of heat. So insulation resists heat flow and is rated for its R value, or in some cases, RSI value. Airflow and pressure difference. The primary objective of this slide is to introduce the importance of continuous air barrier. The air barrier is generally towards the outer surface of the building envelope. So the air barrier is a continuous barrier that is well sealed at each joint and penetration. Air and pressure differences move moisture by the various means. So we take a look, there are three different kind of, we'll call it building dynamics that can take place in a house, in any building, in fact. There's the wind effect, the effect of the wind. Okay, so if we have openings and gaps, the air can basically penetrate into the house or building. We take a look at the stack effect. We might have heard of that term, hot air rises. In this case, heat is rising. So we would say in this, we'll call it three-story building in the middle, the stack effect, a basement, a first and a second floor. The second floor will always be the warmest in the summer. And the heat basically is rising up, and eventually, if it has openings, escaping through the roof. And fluid mechanical effects, okay, is based on the mechanical equipment that's within the building. So the continuous vapor barrier system. When we take a look at the continuous vapor barrier system, not to be confused with the air barrier system, the orange line in this illustration, so the orange line here towards the inside is the vapor barrier, and the green line is represents in this illustration, again, the air barrier. So the orange line in this illustration represents that vapor barrier. Moisture wants to leave from the top of the house or exfiltrate, known as the stack effect, what we saw earlier. Notice that the arrows at the bottom show air coming in or infiltrating into the house. We know that heat rises as well as moisture, and that's in the air with it. Continuity of the vapor barrier system is key. The vapor barrier system is only as good as the weakest point. Its counterpart, the air barrier, sometimes known as the house wrap, is depicted in the green and constructed to control airflow into the building. Air barriers can be located anywhere, but most often on the exterior prior to the finished cladding. Although the National Building Code Section 925 refers separately to vapor barriers and airtight elements in the air barrier system, both roles can be performed by the same product depending on the particular product. So continuous vapor barrier completely around the building. All penetration must be sealed. It must be durable to last the life of the building. So you can see here in this photograph the illustration of this is a vent opening going through the exterior wall, and it's basically sealed around the edges to the vapor barrier. Next, let's go back to some basics. Well, high humidity leads to microbiological troubles. Certain types of bacteria grow better when the moisture level is high, and mold and fungi thrive in a high moisture environment. So building assemblies must be designed to resist the flow of air and moisture. Air leakage can contribute to heat loss, and it can carry water vapor into the wall and ceiling cavities and lead to condensation. The interstitial condensation refers to the moisture condensing in the exterior wall cavities. Next, let's talk about some general practical considerations. So over here was the word interstitial condensation that I referred to earlier. So our third point here, putting principles into practice. When we talk about new construction, the key to moisture management is to stop moisture from getting in to begin with. General building envelope methodologies include the concept of providing both waterproofing and shedding water away from the building elements. One example, providing a rain screen system on an exterior creates air gaps, a water drainage plane that encourages, get rid of that, that encourages water removal beyond. This provides a means of moisture and water to escape the path and basically create drying. Having visited a few First Nation communities, I have often noticed siding at or below grade, and I sometimes ask, how does any trap water really escape? So we can see in this image, basically photograph over to the left, this was a new build. You'll see that the vinyl siding in this particular case is basically has a drainage plane behind it. So there's framing behind it with gaps. If any water did penetrate through, it has a potential to leak out at the base. Basically, good construction requires that there be roughly about 8 to 6 inches of clearance from the ground to the bottom of the siding to allow for water to escape. Otherwise, water can basically build up and we'll call it creep up and penetrate into the upper framing, wood framing of most building structures. So again, that's why it is important. Well, let's talk about a few house design considerations. Well, right from the start of any building designer must be aware of the best design practices. I've listed here some of them. Well, locating a house on a site to address moisture issues is also a good time to optimize orientation of the house for passive solar gains. In other climatic features, passive solar gains can cut space heating costs as one example, provide natural lighting and a more pleasing interior space with that additional lighting. Daylighting. Design and construction quality practices regarding the building enclosure will determine the risk of mold growth and premature decay of building materials. So again, just to touch on a few of the points here, consider orientation of the building in relation to the sun. Passive solar gains can provide 30 to 40% of the space heating needs. Wind patterns can help in air movement and assist in cooling. Vegetation aids in heating, light, wind, as well as noise control. Create dedicated spaces for laundry, storage, and traditional practices, as well as for freezers, dehumidifiers, HRVs, etc. Consideration of the 3Ds of wall cladding: deflect, drain, and dry. Getting back to that rain screen principle. And the fourth one, use decay-resistant materials. Make sure the roof design, roofing materials, overhangs, and pitch, eaves troughs are simple to build and appropriate for the climate. And climatic differences exist. A house built for the south is not a good fit for the northern housing community. There are obvious differences. So next, we're going to talk a little bit of what I've seen on the building envelope problems. We saw a few earlier. Here's a few more. We typically can see visibly condensation on a window, as I mentioned before. However, condensation in concealed spaces can damage and ultimately decay structural materials, and of course contribute to mold growth. Most molds need a surface content of about 20% to begin growth. The National Building Code actually states that the acceptable wood moisture content maximum is 19%. Mold can be controlled by controlling air moisture levels and minimizing condensation. This includes proper site drainage and damp proofing, and the use of soil covers, vapor retarders, along with insulation and certainly ventilation. Concealed condensation is generated by high humidity levels, moisture flow into a wall or attic space, and cold materials in the wall or attic. So in these three images, we can see the very one to the left, the image photograph, very, very wet. And this is the roof sheathing. And basically what we're seeing here is snow that had penetrated a joint between the eave area and the lower part of the roof. This is the back of some wood sheathing, basically in a crawl space. In fact, you can see almost condensation droplets on the back of this, certainly better and clear on a larger image. And this was this was a shower, and we can see the shower wasn't very well sealed. And we can see the wet, dark areas on the back of the exterior sheathing beyond the wood wall framing for this particular area. So again, potential sources of concealed moisture originates in the construction materials. So again, when we talk about the moisture content, the building code talks about moisture content of lumber shall be not more than 19% at the time of installation. I guess the question is, how many builders actually check that? Because a lot of wood is typically a lot higher if it's been sitting out, exposed in the yard to, we'll call it the elements. So let's talk about some common building envelope problems. So problems occur because of the failure of a home to properly react to the outdoor and the indoor environment. We can't entirely blame the house. The house must be designed keeping in mind that the building envelope must serve as a protective shield against the weather to protect the structure and the interior spaces. The use of watertight wall and roof coverings are required to protect the exterior building skin, basically speaking, to drain the rain. It's also important to note that the attention similarly applies to the below grade parts of the building envelope. The blue water droplets in this particular image indicates potential areas of the dew point in the wall. This leads to water damage, materials, and concealed mold issues. I mentioned the word dew point earlier, and basically what we can see here is on the inside of the house is 22 degrees Celsius. And on the outside, we're looking at a temperature of roughly -10 Celsius. So when we talk about the dew point, at what point does basically that moisture that penetrates the inside of the house, traveling towards the outside, turn into basically the dew point, creating water? So this water is going to do what to this insulation or potentially to the back of this wood sheathing? And the issue is create water damage within the building structure. So again, improper flashing, insulation or lack of flashing at windows, doors, and the roof parapet walls. Lack of a drainage plane. In this particular image, I don't see a drainage plane. Missing clogged weep holes when we talk about things such as stone or masonry products, the weep holes so the water can escape. Lack of coordination between the exterior cladding and window and the door installation. These are some of the building envelope common problem areas. Improperly installed roof drains or scuppers. Improperly installed moisture or vapor barriers. Improper installation of exterior cladding and resultant cracking. Improper installing of roofing materials. So again, these are some of the more common areas that I see as problematic areas of where water is going to cause damage to the building envelope. So next we're going to get started here and study the considerations of any site. It's an important part of analyzing the existing land conditions and the potential impact on any building. If you build in a wet area, problems must be expected. Every site has some natural drainage patterns that must be considered even at the design stage. Proper grading and knowledge of the local water table is key to keeping water as best possible away from the structure. So we can see here again in the images is we want water to flow away from the building structure. The other thing is start with a good foundation. But when we talk about foundations, what about water table? Where is the local water table? In this example, how far is it below we'll call it the bottom of the building structure? Bottom of the footings. The building code talks about what distance is we'll call it, it's going to have an impact on the foundation system if water is too close to we'll call it the footing area. And in that case, the size of the footing has to be doubled. So we have to make, we'll call it considerations for larger footings when it comes to situations such as reference to the building code. So when we talk about site selection, consider the drainage, natural and sump backup, the height of the grade and footings, staying out of the water table, ensuring proper grading, making sure surface water go around the building, not towards the building. And if building basements, build them right. Basements are the single greatest source of moisture problems. Getting a little deeper into the foundation, we talk about the foundation drainage. How can we control the water? Ideally, slope the grade to get surface water 6 to 10 feet, approximately 3 meters away from the foundation. In renovations, adjust landscaping or grade to correct the drainage. In new construction, complete final grading early as possible to promote drying and settling of the backfill to avoid the low pocket areas at the foundations. Typically, what happens if the grading is done last, there will be areas of settlement where the soil will settle and create pockets where water can accumulate at the foundation. Also manage bulk water with properly sized eave troughs, downspouts, and splash pads. Otherwise, water will pond at the foundation. So we want to get the water away from, again, slope away from the foundation or the main house, main building. Let's talk a little bit about the floor system. Next, we need to consider the floor. The basic above grade floor consists of wood floor joists and wood sheathing. In some instances, insulation is installed between the joist spaces. But what about a moisture barrier? Is there one on the ground to reduce rising moisture coming up into the floor system? Moisture can seep upwards into that upper interior area. So again, we see a couple of images here where basically crawl space with an uncovered floor, problem. Covering it with a vapor barrier, such as 6 mil polyethylene, okay, with sealed joints. Again, we want to keep the moisture down. Again, moisture traveling, basement moisture water control. So we can see here that moisture, even from the inside, can try and escape above the moisture barrier towards the exterior. So again, how well sealed is our foundation? Basic requirements of a wall system. Well, now let's look at some best practices. In this example, we see a basic 2x6 stud wall in the minimum code compliant assembly for a house that also has a heat recovery ventilation system, an HRV. It's the lowest cost and simplest wall to build or construct of any of the wall types. Certainly, there are more energy efficient wall systems available, Most importantly, installation of an air barrier. If we take a look at number 3 here, air barrier. And number 7, the vapor retarder, the vapor barrier. In walls and attics and sealing of openings and leaks prevents air exfiltration and moisture diffusion. So you want to keep the warm, moist air inside. So you can see how we've kind of curved it and kind of deflecting it back towards the inside. Using a double wall system and installing significant amount of insulation on the exterior of the structure is also an effective method to reduce condensation. This is often done with retrofits. So again, this is a breakdown of a wall system that is preferable at least as a minimum. Okay, let's take a look at the roof systems next. So basic requirements of a roof system. Well, first off, we can see if we look at the points, the bullets here, resistant to control flow of water, air, heat, and cold, be durable, provide strength and rigidity, keep water out and get water off the roof and direct it away from the foundations. So openings in a roof requires proper sealing and an annual review. Moisture trapped in an attic can cause damage and leaks in the ceiling space. Another common issue is ice dams. So in the winter, we sometimes hear about these ice dams or experience ice dams that often cause water damage at the junction of the ceiling to the exterior wall. Primary outed area is noted here in the blue box. So back up the water gets into the house. So in this particular image, we can see water comes down, it melts and it refreezes. And then eventually as it melts again, it causes damage at the soffit area, exterior wall ceiling area. A good reason for proper attic roof ventilation. So we see here, no ventilation, problem. Ventilated, we are going to reduce, hopefully eliminate ice dams with ventilation. Next, what about windows and doors? So when we talk about the building envelope, which I've been trying to do here is cover the foundations, the site, the walls, the roof, and so on. Windows and doors are the next other areas that we need to take a look at. So common window and door problems. Doors and windows need to be installed as per the manufacturer's specifications. Instructions are typically attached on the window or the door. These installation problems were provided by an Atlantic window manufacturer as their leading causes of window problems. Lack of water protection and sealing at a window or door simply leads to water problems, and as noticed, moisture movement and ice condensation freezing in the winter. So again, they've provided this list of improper no shimming, frame is bowed, too much foam was installed. They were installed out of plumb, windows installed as horizontal, drain holes were in the wrong direction. We should see drain holes at the bottom of a window. That allows the water to basically move to the outside of the outer skin of the building envelope. Leaks not being sealed under the sill. Poor flashing leaks at the top of the opening. Not recognize increased risk relative to weather exposure. So again, some of the common window and door problems that allow moisture problems, and again, moisture problems leads to mold problems. Next, infiltrations in the attic space. We can see I've provided 3 images here. We have the insulation, but we have over here freezing snow and moisture basically on the back of wood sheathing. Again, an unsealed opening around a light outlet, a light fixture. Again, we can see the water stain. In the darkening of insulation is a sure tell sign of moisture movement from the inside up through the ceiling into the attic space on the back of this particular insulation, this fiberglass insulation. Monitoring roof penetrations and avoiding the ceiling openings is the best practice, but it's not always possible to not have an opening into the ceiling. Many products are available with a vapor barrier perimeter to increase the tightness. These photos provide examples of moisture and water in the ceiling area. It's not uncommon to have openings for lights at the ceiling of a bathroom, or such as a fan, or even access into the attic access space So attic access opening into the attic. What is important is stopping air leakage by air sealing around the penetrations from the interior of the house into that attic space. Stains become obvious from water damage, and likewise the dark colored insulation, as I spoke about earlier, is a result of air and moisture penetration into the attic space. Attic venting and insulation summary. When we talk about this, the National Building Code requires roof and attic spaces to be ventilated. Typically, this is provided by soffit vents and roof vents, and equally so attention to the attention amount of insulation, soffit ventilation baffles to ensure that the vents are not blocked. Additionally, a continuous vapor barrier is critical and placed on the warm side of the ceiling. So in this particular, we see voids of lack of insulation, which is a problematic area. We see some basically vents here, but we also see some piping here, probably from a bathroom fan going out. So again, looking for some of these vulnerable areas. So it must be insulation must be continuous and a uniform depth. Eliminate wind washing of insulation through the use of soffit baffles. Raise heel trusses make it easier for putting in more insulation. Insulate attic hatches to the same level as the rest of the attic. And compare insulation options based on a cost per square foot installed. For blown insulation, ensure that the voids inside of trusses are filled. This is a blown-in insulation application where it looks like, well, maybe they ran out of insulation, never got to finish over in this void, lack of insulation space. Again, a few key points to kind of summarize what we just looked at or spoke about. So choose a design that fits the site and foundation. Simple in design does not have to be, and needs to be uninteresting, really. Use the sun, consider passive solar characteristics. Ensure the plan has a good water management details. Consider how the floor plan, design, and construction details may contribute to or protect from moisture and mold. Ensure deflection, drainage of moisture, and drying of materials. Provide drainage planes and venting cavities. Properly install the materials. Manage moisture that moves with the air. Aim for airtight construction. Or also select better building materials. Sometimes we hear of this thing called blower door testing. Home energy professionals use a blower door as a diagnostic tool to determine how much air is entering or escaping a home. The only way to really know is whether a home is leaky or not is to measure the air leakage rate with a blower door. Since the blower door forces air through the cracks and holes, the locations of the leaky spots can be identified. The draft of air entering through the holes and cracks can be felt with a hand or a puff of smoke moving through the air leakage locations. So there's a blower door to the right. And over here we have what's called basically a smoke pencil, okay? And they're basically a little squeeze and pushing it out, and we can see which direction it's basically blowing towards the inside or outside as far as air movement is concerned. I've seen the same thing done even with just a simple, we'll call it tissue. We also should think about thermal imaging. I know thermal imaging, the cameras have gotten a lot cheaper, but they can be reasonably expensive for some. Using a thermal imaging camera and under the right circumstances, it's possible to find hidden water and moisture intrusion issues without resorting to destructive testing. Moisture meters are also commonly used to detect moisture problems. Actually, these are some images I had taken on some of my inspections. So for example, the blue on the window is certainly, it's cold outside, so there's a temperature difference. And if we look at the bar scale at the bottom, blue says 15 degrees Celsius, and the red getting up towards 25 plus. If we take a look at the corner of this inside of the house, we can see dark blue. That's a potential area of moisture penetration or possibly water leakage at that particular point. And if we take a look along this beam here, which is just on the inside before we get to the outside, we can see some blue also developing here. So again, moisture buildup in this particular, we'll call it ceiling space. This is a roof. So this is a vent pipe, a plumber's vent pipe. And we can see colors from blue, moisture problems, water problems, to the heated area over here, getting into the yellows, oranges, and reds. So again, potential moisture buildup. This is me with what I call a handheld moisture meter, a contactless. You can get some with pins. This is a contactless one where I'm measuring the back of drywall in a basement. And actually the reading is on the, we'll call it the red scale, which means high moisture content. And of course, here's kind of a clue, the dark spot. So the thermal imaging camera cannot see moisture in walls, but it can detect subtle temperature differences in a pattern that reveals the possible existence of water. Hence the blue color is colder versus the red color hot, dry. Thermal cameras can help locate water and approximate the moisture extent, but identify a pattern that looks like moisture does not guarantee the presence of water. Don't forget about moisture meters. Okay, so just a couple of other tools that are in my inspection toolkit. Mechanical systems. We drill down to mechanical systems. They're really important also when we talk about moisture and mold. Mechanical systems can regulate the indoor temperature and overall air movement and indoor moisture levels. All areas of house must be provided with heat to prevent moisture condensation and certainly mold growth. Building codes requires a minimum design temperature for finished spaces of 22 degrees Celsius or 72 degrees Fahrenheit. It should be sufficient to protect the building and system from moisture issues. By the way, unlike energy recovery ventilation systems and heat recovery ventilators do not reduce humidity in the home, but they can reduce the moisture by exhausting moist air out of the home. So again, poor HVAC design can lead to moisture and air quality issues. Controlling humidity should be a design criteria for all mechanical systems. Forced air systems, improper test and balance can result in increased air leakage. So again, if I drill down, a lack of an HRV and ERV maintenance also is a big concern. Often I see HRVs or ERVs. They're pretty simple units that are easy to maintain. Lack of, we'll call it maintenance, such as dirty block air filters, they're not going to work, and you're not going to get air movement. And the HRV basically helps remove that moist air out of the home. So it helps in the reduction of moist air. Also, we need to think about plumbing. Minimize the risk of water leakage and damage by, and there's a number of factors here. Natural plumbing involves water. From a design and builder's perspective, it's a bad idea to run plumbing through the outside walls because of the potential of freezing and causing, we'll call it breaks in the leaks within the system. If it's necessary, insulate well on the outside and do not insulate on the interior side to keep the pipes basically warm and stop them from freezing and causing a leak. So again, we see review of a bathroom, wet areas. In this particular case, this is poor drainage. This is going uphill rather than downhill where water is supposed to go in a drain. And on top of that, there's leakage. So again, taking a look at a review of the plumbing considerations is an important part of also looking for water. Again, let's think of the house as a system from the mechanical point of view. Mechanical systems regulate the indoor temperature, overall air movement, and indoor moisture levels. Heating and its counterpart cooling system should be appropriately sized for the home, and ventilation should be sufficient to protect the building and systems from moisture issues. So pay attention to combustion equipments, including venting and fuel delivery storage. Provide ventilation to control humidity and odors. At a minimum, good bath fans and a range hood vented to the outside. Consider a balanced ventilation system, an HRV or an ERV, heat recovery or energy recovery ventilators. Use dehumidification to control summer humidity in basements. As I mentioned, I run a dehumidifier in my basement to reduce moisture buildup. Houses with low rates of air leakage are better able to maintain indoor air temperature and overall, we'll call it human comfort. What about space heating? In Canada, all homes are built with heating systems, and an increased number are also built with cooling systems. Most Canadian homes are heated throughout. This is possible because the homes are well insulated and reasonably draft-free. Central forced air furnace with ductwork is the most common space heating system in most of Canada. However, not all parts of Canada. The most common fuel is natural gas. Other fuels include oil, electricity, propane, and wood. So let's talk about some strategies to prevent mold. Next, what are some of these strategies? Get the size right for furnaces and air conditioners through the proper heat loss and heat gain calculations. This is something that's not done very often unless it's done by a mechanical engineer. So get our size right from the beginning, not, oh, well, roughly it should be this size. The National Building Code requires the use of the CSA F280 to size the systems. Again, talking about building code. Get the ducting designed and installed properly, so ductwork. Seal joints in a forced air system ductwork. It should be taped at any of the joints, certainly properly connected. Ventilated, put the V back in the HVAC system. So in other words, make sure we have a good ventilation system when we talk about heating, ventilating, and air conditioning. Filter air coming into the house and into the furnace. Proper dehumidification when necessary. Due consideration for certainly combustion safety. So ducting impacts indoor air quality. So during construction, dust and debris often fall into the ductwork, but even in the best of circumstances, airborne dust collects in the ductwork. Equally as important, ductwork must be properly sealed. So we can see here in this photograph, the ductwork is properly sealed. So this is our main trunk. This is a branch coming off of it. So keep ducts in conditioned spaces inside the thermal barrier, not in the outside walls or attics or in garages. Seal ducts to get air where you need it. Otherwise, you're losing air through these joints. So air leakage on the supply can force potentially moist air into hidden and cooler cavities. Air leakage on the returns side can draw pollutants into the duct system and circulate them in the house. So when we talk about wood heating systems can also present some concerns, particularly with wet wood. In internal storage, certainly of that wet wood. Wood should be dried to as low a moisture content as possible in the range of roughly 20%. I mentioned about dehumidifiers. So dehumidification. When we talk about dehumidification, every house with a basement or a conditioned crawl space should have a dehumidifier. A dedicated dehumidifier is often the only practical, low-cost way of controlling indoor moisture and humidity. Even in homes with air conditioners, there should be a dehumidifier because air conditioning is not typically needed in the spring or the fall, times when dehumidification only is needed. Dehumidifiers can be expensive to operate as they consume a great amount of electricity, but look for Energy Star rated appliances can help keep the operating costs down. Drain humidifiers to a floor drain or other location to avoid having to deal with emptying them when they get full. So again, proper drainage to condensate is important. Back to our heat recovery ventilation systems, HRVs. So ventilation is more than just bringing outdoor air in and exhausting stale air out. To be successful, a ventilation system must exchange indoor air and outdoor air. It must treat the outdoor air so it's acceptable to the occupants. It must distribute the air to each and every room of the house, and it must circulate the air within each room of the house. This is a reason codes have evolved with ventilation requirements from simple window openings to exhaust-only fans to the higher performing systems that are required today. So when we take a look at this image again, we see a photograph. The blue is warm, we'll call it stale air exhausting, with typically picking up moisture from the air within certain spaces, such as bathrooms, laundry spaces, and perhaps the kitchen. Okay. And then we see the green is the outside air coming back in and going through this, we'll call it core, and then being circulated back into the house. So a balanced air exchange. So an indoor-outdoor air exchange, the treatment of incoming air and tempering and filtering, air distribution to all rooms, air circulation within the rooms. It's more than just stale air out and just fresh air in. Mechanical ventilation and pollutant source control are required to ensure that there's reasonable indoor air quality inside the house. It must be sufficient either to remove pollutants and humidity generated indoors or to dilute their concentrations to acceptable levels for health and comfort of the occupants. So again, this is a image of a heat recovery ventilator. We see the heat exchanger, cool fresh air coming in, going through this heat exchanger. Okay, warm air, dry air into the house, warm moist air being exhausted out, basically helping to preheat the exchange air here in this heat exchanger, warming up, let's say, the cooler or colder air and giving it a little bit of a temperature difference of absorbing the heat of that air being exhausted out of the house. So exhaust stale wet air from kitchen, bathrooms, and laundry are the focus for heat recovery. Provides fresh, dry air to the bedrooms and mainly living areas, is comfortable, quiet, and controllable. Becomes filters incoming fresh air, is balanced, safe with combustion appliances. There's no backdrafting or combustion spillage, and it's energy efficient. Next, there we go, mechanical ventilation. There are different approaches to provide good house ventilation to manage moisture in a house. There are 3 examples here. So ventilation is a very powerful way to manage moisture in a home in winter. Colder and drier outdoor air, the more moisture it can remove. There's an example here, but there are 3 approaches to ventilation. What's called an exhaust-only system, basically exhausting with a fan, pulling the air out of the house. But when we do that, we basically are also pulling potentially colder, drafty air inside the house. The supply-only system, okay? So we could have air coming in, more fresh air brought into the house, but unfortunately, we also, the downside is uncomfortable, drafty conditions can still exist. If we have a balanced system, which is the ideal system, which the code talks about, a balanced system, it talks about the example is the HRV, heat recovery ventilation. There's no pressurization or depressurization problems. In other words, balance. May not have heat recovery, and it certainly uses electricity. So again, there are 3 approaches to mechanical ventilation. So when we talk about mechanical ventilation, based on the National Building Code, the table that is at the bottom indicates the minimum requirements based on the number of bedrooms for a house. This example is for a 3-bedroom house. A larger group occupancies requires requirements under a different part of the building code. So when we talk about what is a minimum requirement, okay, we talk about something like this. So we have 3 bedrooms on the average home, 3-bedroom home. That talks about the ventilation rates, okay, minimum of 22, and 22 is liters per second. But if we convert that to maybe what some of us understand as CFM, basically that equates to 46.8 or roughly a 50 CFM fan. Typically, you would find something like that in the 40 to 50 range in a bathroom fan, a bathroom exhaust fan. So enough to control the moisture and pollutants from the occupants in their daily activities, enough to handle larger group in occupancy, at least for a short-term basis, sufficient to exhaust and dilute moisture and pollutants from building materials. So when we talk about exhaust fans not operating in a bathroom, we must anticipate there's going to be moisture buildup. And again, moisture buildup gets back to the M word, mold. So let's talk about ventilation summary, the moisture mover. Proper ventilation gives you a proactive way to manage moisture and mold problems at the source. So we get back to build tight, ventilate right, far more effective and efficient than counting on leaky houses to perform. Houses need mechanical ventilation, exchange, treatment, distribution, and circulation. Get the stale air out and get the fresh air in, air exchange. Ventilation is needed to exhaust moist air and odors and bring in fresh air. HRVs are the best strategy to manage moisture and improve air quality, but they need to be understood by the occupants that are hopefully going to be maintaining them. HRVs only work if they are properly designed, installed, operated, and maintained by the home occupants. They ensure that they are easy to access for maintenance. Part 4 of my presentation is about renovating to prevent mold. We see here one of our native gentlemen caulking and sealing around the window on a newer build, way back in 2006. We know that mold will grow indoors if moisture is present. Therefore, we must control dampness indoors as well as addressing better sealing of the exterior of the building envelope. Air sealing and insulation, which are common elements of energy efficiency upgrade packages, come with a bonus. In addition to saving energy, they always almost cut dampness and mold. So how do we eliminate the water source? Moisture problems are preventable. They do not happen until water moves from a source into some part of the building that they should not be approaching, that should be dry. So containing the water source is the cheapest and most cost-effective method of stopping condensation. That doesn't mean stopping your showering or cooking. Exhaust fans in baths and kitchens and properly connected clothes dryers can remove a fair amount of moisture. Foundations, as we saw earlier, must be kept dry. All siding leaks, and that is true. We think it's pretty weather-tight and leak-proof, but it's not. However, doing the right thing is by insulating and air sealing with a water-resistant barrier are critical steps to eliminate the water damage. Mixing cold outside air with wet, moist attic air causes condensation. Frost or icicles may be visible, for example, in the attic. Indoor humidity should be low enough to prevent condensation on the windows. And a house must have a good ventilation system. So everything we know about new construction applies to existing housing. Existing housing is unique and takes due time and certainly consideration. But modifications can be made through the retrofit, providing a practical solution to moisture and mold problems. So again, think of the house as a system. The webinar started by looking at new construction. Now it's time to apply this to understanding renovations. Installing new windows and doors is the most important moisture control action for an older home. The next best retrofit is air sealing the exterior building envelope. Installing a rain screen system to create gaps behind the siding to encourage drying, and fix any problems areas outside of the home, such as poor grading around the house. Well, maybe it's time to stop testing and start fixing. Unless the cause of mold has been identified and solved, mold will simply reappear. In some cases, mold damage may be so great you'll need to decide whether to fix the house or not. So again, if you know that you have mold, stop testing, and testing will tell you have mold, so start fixing. Knowing the type of mold will not change the cleanup procedures. Clean up the mold and fix the source of the moisture. It's important to recognize the role that occupants' lifestyle might play in moisture and mold problems. Plan to ensure a quick, thorough cleanup and stick to your plan. Basements and crawl spaces. Always consider the need to deal with the source of moisture first, or as part of the renovation. If the moisture problem can't be fixed, a high water table or occasional flooding, it may be necessary to replace and raise the foundation or separate the foundation space from the indoor space with insulation, air barrier, and vapor barrier systems. Other common steps to dealing with damp foundations are covered at the end on the next slide. So we deal with the moisture problem first, cover expose any dirt floors, insulate foundation walls, air seal, and insulate the rim joists. So again, here we see here, this is a basement with insulation in the vapor barrier. We also see up in the rim joist, or some people might call that the header area, where we basically have the floor joist tying into the outside, and that must also be insulated. In this particular case, it's kind of unusual. They drilled holes as their means of putting ventilation into the crawl space. So there's, I think, eight drilled holes in through that particular rim joist. Basements or crawl spaces. Well, the photos of an extremely wet crawl space in need of correction. What do you think? Well, in this particular case, there's no ground cover. They have a sump pump, basically, that's not operating. We can see a big puddle of water underneath the house. Imagine that basically infiltrating and basically penetrating into the upper floor. Again, another crawl space, uninsulated. Again, a lot of old wood construction and debris in the basic crawl space. Again, ponded water within the crawl space. So again, install a sump pump with a sealed cover to deal with perimeter drainage. If you can, install a dehumidifier, but only in closed conditioned spaces. Seal any cracks or holes in the foundation walls. Good point for water to penetrate into the crawl space. Fix the grading around the building. Install window wells where necessary. Ensure the eaves trough drains away from the foundation. Next, exterior wall renovations. Solutions offered to each of these potential problems, however, must be carried out by qualified professionals and coordinated by your housing or maintenance manager. There are 4 primary reasons for retrofitting the exterior: to fix water leaks through the wall, around or below windows, upgrade a combination with window replacement, replace faulty or deteriorated siding, make energy efficiency improvements. These situations provide the opportunity to improve water management, reduce moisture and mold problems, air seal and insulate to reduce operating costs, improve comfort, and improve aesthetics and curb appeal of the house. So build and renovate with the occupants in mind. You have to also think about the people living in the house. Identifying and eliminating the source of the moisture is the first and foremost important step. This may involve major repairs or structural modifications, such as adding insulation or increasing ventilation with fans. It may include changing behaviors and habits of the occupants. Again, as we said, we don't want them to stop taking showers or cleaning. But when we think about the house system, we need to remember the occupants. The occupants play a direct role in determining whether a house gets and stays moldy. Some mold problems are tied to poor constructions. Others are much tied to the lifestyle, habits, and upkeep and housekeeping. Houses that are clean and dry can't grow mold. A mold-free house is a result of both good building practices and good management and maintenance, and certainly living habits. Home occupants must be part of the overall mold remediation process if they are going to be part of the solution. Education workshops and follow-up visits with occupants are an important part of components of successful housing. Build with the occupants in mind. Here are some final thoughts regarding the occupants. Everyone has a role and responsibility to avoid and prevent mold from becoming a bigger problem. So when we think about this, builders and housing managers and householders are the 3 key players who must work together in an effort to control moisture and prevent mold to be successful. It's important to inform the home occupants about their responsibilities to include them in housing maintenance and remediation process. Plan follow-up visits 4 to 6 weeks after occupancy to inspect for mold and conduct another 1-year post-occupancy review. The most important mold prevention strategy is for occupants to contact the housing department about any moisture-related issues and for housing department to respond in an effective and certainly timely manner. Again, thank you and good luck. The way to control mold is to control moisture. We can see there are various means to reduce it right from the start. Hopefully you can take away a few key points that I've covered here to build and renovate with the relationship of moisture and mold in mind. I'd like to give some credits to CMHC for their support and certainly encouragement in creating this webinar based on Build and Renovate to Avoid Mold. FNNBOA, some of their material from their technical guides for northern housing, particularly booklet 7 and 8. The inspection photographs that I provided, Ontario Home Inspections, and the illustrated guide, images such as what we see on this page from Carson Dunlop, a great guide for images that can help project some of the technical issues. So again, reducing moisture, again, if we just kind of quickly review what's on this particular image, don't store firewood inside, repair foundation leaks, disconnect and remove humidifiers if you have one, cover earth floors, so ground cover sump pits, don't hang dry laundry to dry inside, vent clothes dryers to the outside, use kitchen and bathroom exhaust fans, and limit the use of misters and steam generators. Again, thank you. This is presented on behalf of certainly CMHC and FNNBOA, First Nation Building Officers. Again, thank you for the opportunity to present this to you. There will be some follow-up. So, John, any questions?
Yeah, good, Claude. You can go drink some water now.